ask that you please mute yourselves throughout the entire 90 minutes. Thirdly, there will be a question and answer session following the presentation. We ask that all questions be submitted in the Teams chat feature once Dr. Eadie has concluded his presentation. We're hopeful that we can get all of the questions answered during the session, and apologize in advance if we're not able to get to yours. I will now turn it over to James Michel, CEO of Access Health CT.
Thank you, Margot, and welcome all to. This is the very first time we have teamed up with Dr. Eadie and Trinity Health of New England. With that said, with the intro from Margot, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Eadie as we have a very lengthy 90 minutes of discussion to go through. Dr. Eadie.
Thank you, and let me say thank you to the entire Access Health team and your leadership, Mr. Michel, for engaging such an important conversation, or engaging residents in the state of Connecticut in such an important conversation. So I'm going to jump right in. I will speak rather quickly, only because I know we've got some special guests, and my most important and favorite part about such presentations is the Q&A. I think that's really when people get personal with their questions, get their questions answered and their concerns addressed. So why don't we jump right in here? Let me see what. All right, perfect. So I will engage you for probably about 30, 40 minutes. These are the topics I'm going to discuss. I won't go through them individually, but you see them in front of you. To the extent where I don't discuss them or cover them to your satisfaction, please drop the question or ask for a reiteration of any sort in the chat box. And of course, I was lucky enough or blessed enough to have received recognition from the Access Health team. And I just wanted to thank you all for the kind words. I shared it with my entire team, which was a large number of people. And we are going to emulate the way you guys did this. This was just amazing how you captured all of the positive remarks from the conversation we had previously. So thank you all with my heart for being so kind and receiving me as a speaker, and those kind words that was certainly uplifting during such anomalous times. So let's take a look at where we've been this year. So over the last 12 months, and in fact tomorrow, we are celebrating here at Trinity Health of New England. Well, I shouldn't say celebrating, but we are recognizing instead, I should say, the 1-year anniversary of the pandemic. To reflect, remember back in February in the state of Washington, there was just one confirmed case. Now, that's not to suggest that people didn't die from COVID in the month of January or December, which more than likely that is the case. But nonetheless, when we started looking for it as a healthcare system in this country, there was one confirmed death. And then, we had our first case here in Connecticut on the 8th of March, if I remember correctly. It was declared a pandemic on the 11th of March. And we went from one confirmed death, COVID-related death, to over 5,000, and it extended throughout all 50 states. So that's just to reflect on that for just a moment. And then we peaked in to the fourth week of April at 60,000 cases. And we thought that really was a lot, but we had no idea what we had coming. And so we sort of bent the curve. We flattened the curve, as you see in front of you. And then we, as predicted in October, because of Halloween, we're pretty sure and comfortable forecasting that we thought that things were going to get worse. And then in November, because of Thanksgiving, we were pretty sure that people were going to gather, although they were advised not to around Thanksgiving. Then December was Christmas. December was Kwanzaa. December were a number of other holidays like Hanukkah. And then we had New Year's Eve. That was a big celebration. So you see those 3 months of celebration, and you see those 3 months of an increased rate in deaths per month as well. And then we ended the year, then there was Three Kings Day, of course, but we ended the year on record as having the most deadly year ever experienced in this country. And then, of course, in January, that was the most deadly month that we'd ever seen in this country. And as a physician, we're all taught as clinicians that the 3 common causes of death, which Access Health knows very well, being heart disease, stroke, and cancer, but not since this pandemic started. The number 1 cause of death, unfortunately, now is the coronavirus. So we've seen a lot, we've been through a lot, and it's just through the grace of God that we're all here participating in this educational session today. Listen, I have been rather controversial with my position on the so-called vaccine hesitancy. So I thought I would add a slide just to cover that, because I want you all to know, when you see and hear me publicly saying that I do not believe that such vulnerable communities in the state of Connecticut or across the country suffer from vaccine hesitancy. It didn't sit well for me initially because the United States said that these vulnerable communities were hesitant even well before the vaccine was even presented to the FDA for approval. So that was pretty odd, because how dare we suggest that people, and in my mind, you're blaming these highly vulnerable communities. This is my opinion. Let me underscore that. But I thought it would be important to look at the definition of vaccine hesitancy. And I'm encouraging people to eliminate vaccine hesitancy, or the word vaccine hesitancy, from your vocabulary. And here's why I suggest that. There's three components to the definition. First, vaccine hesitancy it refers to a delay in acceptance or refusal of vaccines despite, and I'm underscoring despite, the availability of vaccine services. That is not the problem that I am seeing here in Connecticut. It is not that people are not willing to roll up their sleeves and get vaccinated. They just want to know more about the virus, and they just want to know more about the vaccine. So again, another high five to Access Health, because they're providing this information to their colleagues and to the community at large. But it's the inability to access vaccine, just like it's the inability to access in many vulnerable communities a provider who understands you and your culture, or access a hospital, or even access a primary care physician, or accessing healthcare insurance. Access is the problem, not vaccine hesitancy. I want to know more about the vaccine. Does not equal hesitancy. Here's a second component of the definition, that it's a complex, yes it is, and context specific, varying across time, place, and vaccines. That doesn't apply to the feedback and the experience that I'm having done probably north of 50 of these conversations in the state of Connecticut alone. And then third, and most disturbing to me, is that this so-called vaccination hesitancy that exists in these highly vulnerable communities is influenced by factors such as complacency. Look, I am never going to allow anyone to say that these vulnerable populations are complacent with the number of deaths that occur in their respective communities. No one's happy or complacent or satisfied seeing their loved ones and their friends die every single day. Remember, we got up to almost 4,000 deaths a day in this country. And the vulnerable communities, I think they're misrepresented when we suggest that they're complacent. Convenience, now that's a problem, because having a convenient way to access the vaccine or a convenient way to access education is a problem. And again, we're trying to mitigate as much as that is possible. So that's really the only component about this entire definition. This is not Eadie's definition. This is the World Health Organization's definition. So it's the definition every time we use it. So again, let's use it with caution, and let's not point the finger at vulnerable communities as if it's their fault that they are not going to be vaccinated, because it's not their fault. It's our fault, because we need to do a better job in getting the vaccine to the community and educating the communities the way they want to be educated, not the way we think they should be educated. And then the last component is confidence. Now, listen, there is some mistrust or untrust around the healthcare industry for vulnerable communities, particularly these communities of color, and there's a reason to be. So let me start by saying that we don't lack confidence in the vaccines. We don't not believe that the vaccines don't work, especially after participating in such a conversation. I realize this is emotional. This is my soapbox. You probably did not tune in for that. But I beseech you to consider the definition. Just do a Google search and understand the definition of vaccination hesitancy before you claim that a group of people based on their ethnicity or their race or their socioeconomic status is hesitant. Because by this definition, the people that I've been talking to are not hesitant. They just want their concerns addressed. They want their questions answered, and they want equity in vaccine distribution. They want access to the vaccine, and that is not vaccine hesitancy. All right, so let's talk about herd immunity. I'm sorry about that, but I just wanted to be clear, because I'm getting emails and letters, and when I'm out in public, people are saying, I don't agree with you in your position of vaccine hesitancy. And that's fine. You don't have to agree with it. But I thought it was my obligation to share with you all why I don't think that vaccine hesitancy has ever been a problem or is a problem currently in the state of Connecticut in these such vulnerable communities. And I'm going by the definition. And I'm being emotional about it because I think that my understanding, interpretation of the definition happens to be right, at least in my mind, but that's my opinion. The definition of herd immunity is not my opinion. Let's talk about that. So herd immunity is the ultimate goal here. The reason why we're having these conversations, we're not trying to twist arms and talk people and get them vaccinated, but instead we're trying to arm you with the knowledge so that you can make an intelligent or well-informed decision as to what's best for you and your family. But the ultimate goal here, in order for us to remove our masks, no longer social distance the way we're doing, is to reach herd immunity. So Dr. Fauci started off during the first wave talking about herd immunity, and he thought that about 70% of the population needs to be immune, and that's when we can then comfortably remove our masks. Now that number is about 80 to 85%, depending upon the source that you're experiencing. But herd immunity means this. It's the majority of the people, again, let's say 70 to 85%. I like to say 80% of the people have an immunity to the coronavirus. Now you see at the bottom, there's two ways to establish immunity, either through exposure, which when you have thousands of people dying every single day, not like 5,000 people in the month of March or one person in the month of February. We're talking about every single day, thousands of people are dying. And I'm sure everyone on this participating in this virtual conversation knows someone directly or indirectly who has unfortunately succumbed to the virus. That's one way to reach it. That will probably take 5 years, is my estimation, to get there. And so do the math of how many people will die, which will include some of us participating in this virtual meeting today, if we waited that long. The only other way to reach herd immunity is through vaccination. And that's why I volunteer my time to talk to as many people. It can be one, it can be 1,000, to at least share my experiences and the intelligence that I know and the interpretation of the science that I have on why it's important. Why it's important for us to reach herd immunity, not necessarily why it's important for you to get vaccinated. My prayer, though, is by the end of this conversation, you will make your decision to do so, and it will be in favor of us reaching herd immunity. So another concern that people have is the fact that this vaccine was produced in such a short period of time. So let's talk about just a couple of numbers. I'm not going to go through this busy slide, but I just want to draw your attention to the red circle. So you see the top horizontal line is the typical process. So this is the typical process it takes in the United States of America for a vaccine to be produced and then approved by the Federal Drug Administration. We're talking about, in this case, emergency use authorization. So it takes about 6 months or 73 months on average. Now that's probably, I'm guessing, how long it'll take if we passively or through exposure reach herd immunity. And listen, we don't have 5 years or 6 years or 73 months. We can't afford that because too many people are dying every single day. So when the charge came for these manufacturers, we're talking specifically about Pfizer, Moderna, and now Johnson & Johnson. When the charge came for them to quickly produce a vaccine, they were only able to do so for a couple of reasons, and I wanted to just share those with you. So a couple take-home points on how they were able to produce the vaccine so quickly. So in the typical process, which takes about 73 months on average, and to put things in perspective, the influenza vaccine, the flu vaccine, took almost 10 years to produce. So the typical process is done in series, so step by step, right? So in sequence. So you couldn't go to step 2 until step 1 was done, step 3 until step 2 was done, and so on and so on and so on. That is why it takes so long. Now, because of something called an RNA technology, which we're going to talk about in just a second, let's go down to the accelerated process. They took this technology that existed for probably almost 10 years. They stopped the line in which they were using it for to come up with a vaccine and a cure for cancer. And they decided, you know what, let's try to focus in the midst of a pandemic on creating very quickly a vaccine. And so the difference is, one, they had the RNA technology. We'll talk about that in a second. The second difference is that they didn't do things in stepwise fashion, right? They did things in what I call parallel. So in other words, they did step 1 and step 2 at the same time, parallel. They did step 3 and step 4 at the same time, simultaneously in parallel. And that's how they were able to reduce it significantly to the target at that time was 14 months. But you and I both know that we're just going to be acknowledging or recognizing a year of the pandemic on tomorrow. And we had the vaccine, the first vaccine available in December. So they clearly beat their target deadline by having it in a much shorter period of time. It was produced in the same year that the pandemic started. So the point here is that They were able to produce it only because they took some RNA technology that already existed and brought it into the laboratory and focused on a vaccine for the pandemic or against the coronavirus. They did not jeopardize, I need you to hear this, quality, safety, efficacy, nor did they skip any steps. And so that's why I am comfortable having this conversation with you today. Wanted to put that at rest for you as well. So I want to quickly go through what I call my IKEA analogy. The purpose of this analogy is to use an IKEA analogy to introduce what DNA is, introduce what RNA is. Therefore, we can talk about how the virus works, and then we can talk about how the vaccines work. So imagine my wife, Kimberly, sent me to IKEA to purchase a table and 8 chairs. So she took a picture of it. She texted it to me. She sent me to IKEA on a Saturday morning with the honey-do list. I then, if you've been to IKEA before, I got the big long cart. I rolled the cart down the aisle where the boxes are. I identified the table based on the picture she had texted me, and then I loaded the box onto my cart. I'm making my way up to the register to pay for the box. And then because the line, which is usually long at IKEA, was long in this analogy, I decided to open up the box. It's just the Virgo in me, and peruse the instruction manual. So I did that. And by the time I got to the register, I said to the man or woman at the register, there's no way in heck I'm going to be able to put this together. I'm just not the handyman. So in addition to paying for the product, can I also pay for assembly? They happen to say, yes, we do have an assembler. So let's call this person an assembler in the back of the store who, for a fee, can put together your table and 8 chairs. So I paid for that, and they took my cart to the back of the store for the assembler to assemble it. This red circle represents all activities that take place inside of IKEA, right? So keep that in mind. Red circle inside of IKEA, which is important. We'll talk about in just a second what happens inside of your human cells. But for this analogy, realize that once the assembler completes assembling the table and chairs, then I then must take the assembled table and chair outside of IKEA, load it up on my vehicle. So now I'm outside of the circle, and then take it home so that we can utilize it. So hopefully you understood that analogy. So let's move on. And this is the same analogy. It just looks a bit different. So the circle is inside of IKEA. The box is the first arrow, which has the instruction manual, the parts and the tools. The second arrow is when my cart with the box went to the assembler opens up the box, and what does he or she see? The instruction manual. They see the parts. They see the tools that comes with the box, and then they do their work. So realizing that the box does absolutely nothing. It just houses information. The assembler takes the housed information in the box, and they decode, if you will, interpret the instructions there, and then they assemble it, and then they roll that back up to the front of the store. I exit IKEA, or the red circle in this analogy, load it up and take it home. So now let's imagine this red circle is not IKEA anymore. Let's imagine it's one of the million cells that you have inside of your body, right? Okay, so remember, you've got the box that houses the information. You have the assembler who does the work based on the box or the information. And then you've got the red circle, which is your human cell. And then outside of the human cell is the assembled table and chairs that I now take home. All right, so if you got that, let's change up just a little bit. We're not going to get too scientific, but I just want to make sure that you all understand what DNA is, what RNA is, and then you will understand, if I do this correctly, how the virus works and how the vaccine works. All right, so now let's replace the box, right, which houses the code, which houses the information. It's a package of information, and let's replace that with DNA, because that's what DNA is. You get half of the information from your mother, half of the information from your father, and it sits inside of your cells, inside of your nucleus, and that's your DNA. That's what's unique to you, unless of course you have the egg, and the egg was fertilized and then split into two, and you have identical twins in your family. You too will have the same DNA as well. But nonetheless, you have half of the DNA from your mom, half the DNA from your dad, and that's equivalent to the box in the analogy for IKEA. That's where all the information, everything you need. But the box in of itself does not do the work, right? It's the assembler. So the assembler is RNA. That's what RNA does. RNA reads the genetic code, if you will, and then, which is the instruction manual that you got half from your mom, half from your dad. And it goes to work to produce whatever the genetic code tells it to produce. It can produce cells for your skin, cells for your liver. It is the reason why your skin's the color it is, your eyes are the color they are. If you have hair, unlike me, how your hair is replaced over time. And it also has a code in there to tell it when the hair will turn gray. So all that is built into the coding and the instruction manual inside of your cell. And then, so that's what DNA does. It houses it's like the box, it houses the information. The RNA does the work. And then the final product, so now that's your cell, the final product that RNA has produced is released into your bloodstream. So that's what DNA is, that's what RNA is, and that's how it works inside your body. Draw your attention to the top right corner of your slide, and you see there's a unilateral or one-way flow of information and activity. DNA is the genetic code. The RNA interprets it and does some activity, and in this case, it produces the protein, and then it puts the protein wherever it's supposed to be, sometimes in your blood, whatever the case may be. But the point here is that if there were arrows that can go in the opposite direction, I would have simply put arrows going from protein to RNA and RNA to DNA. But that's not the case. That's not how the creator made it to work. So when people say that when you get this RNA-based vaccine, which will make sense in just a second, that it can alter your DNA, that is not true, because RNA never goes in reverse into your nucleus and interacts with your DNA. So it will not alter your DNA. Just wanted to add that there. I'll be debunking, if you will, or providing some degree of hallucination to the narratives that are out there in particular. All right, so now let's talk about how the coronavirus works, right? This excites me, so bear with my level of excitement here. So top left corner of your slide, you've seen that illustration multiple times. It is an illustration of the coronavirus, and it's sort of what it looks like microscopically when you look into a microscope. And if you stain it with color, and particularly red, this is kind of what it looks like. The point here is that there's two components of the coronavirus that we're going to talk about for the remaining of the conversation. One are those protrusions on the circle called spike proteins, right? So I like to refer to them, just to make it simple for me to explain it to you, which is my job if I do this correctly. And I like to refer to it as an arm and a hand. An arm and a hand. It kind of looks like an arm and a hand because it kind of looks like this, right? So that's what the spike protein does, and it'll make sense as to why I call it arm and hand in just a second. And then look at that white squiggly line on the inside of the coronavirus. So they simply opened up 25% of the coronavirus. You can take a peek on the inside. They're not showing you the DNA, so don't worry about that. But that's the RNA. The RNA, remember, reads the DNA, and then the RNA does the work to produce whatever it has been instructed to do. In this case, the DNA of the coronavirus tells the RNA to produce an entire new coronavirus. From nuts to bolts, the entire circle with all of the protrusions or spike proteins or arm and hands and everything else that makes up a coronavirus. So that whole squiggly line is an important part to how the coronavirus infects you as a human. All right, so let's talk about what it does. So the coronavirus, the arm and the hand, they have a primary function of doing just this. That is that the coronavirus, the hands of the arm and hand, the spike protein, literally grabs onto one of your human cells. The hands punch holes into your human cells for one reason only, and that is to deposit its entire RNA into one of your cells. So when it deposits an entire RNA into one of your cells, you know exactly what's going to happen, right? The RNA of the coronavirus, once it punches holes, is going to deposit its RNA, complete RNA, and that's important for me to underscore right now, the entire RNA. And what does it do? It produces another coronavirus. So that's why you go from one coronavirus, once you inhale it or ingest it, to 2, and then to 4, to 8, to 16, to 32, and so on and so on. And if that number grows to the extent where it impacts the nerves that are responsible for your smell, you lose your smell. Your taste, you lose your taste. In your lungs, it creates your inability to bring in oxygen and blow out carbon dioxide. And those are people who get in trouble. They need to be hospitalized or placed on a ventilator. And unfortunately, thousands of them die every single day because this is a very aggressive virus. So let me give a quick analogy to sort of put this in perspective before I go to the next slide. So let's say, Mr. Jones, proverbial Mr. Jones, came into a building got on an elevator alone, went up to the 3rd floor, and before Mr. Jones got off of the elevator, let's imagine that Mr. Jones took his mask off for one reason or another. And when he took his mask off, because no one was looking and he doesn't like to wear a mask, let's just pretend that's the case, Mr. Jones was positive for COVID-19 or the coronavirus. And so what Mr. Jones did is he released this microscopic virus in the air. And we know now that when you release the virus in the air, if it's just through normal breathing or talking, it can go at least 6 feet away. And that's why social distancing is 6 feet. But it's important for you to know that if someone is singing or has a pressured speech like I'm doing now as I orate, that I can push it further than 6 feet. So just keep in mind that 6 feet social distancing is the minimum amount. All right, so Mr. Jones, his elevator lands on the 3rd floor, the doors open, he puts his mask back on, and he exits the elevator. Now, microscopically, there's coronaviruses floating in the air, and they will float in the air until some period of time when gravity brings them down, and they will eventually die. The only time a coronavirus can stay alive is if it has access to a human cell, punches holes in the cell, deposits its entire RNA, and now it begins to reproduce and has a family. So coronaviruses, just like humans, want to have families, and they want to reproduce. They want to survive. They want to last forever, which is also why they mutate, by the way. But we'll get to that in just a second. So Mr. Jones is off the elevator. The elevator now is filled in the air with coronavirus. So let's say Mrs. Smith comes into the building. Mrs. Smith is going to the 5th floor. She calls the elevator. It comes down, door opens. She gets on the elevator. Now, for whatever reason, let's say Mrs. Smith also does not like to wear a mask. So Mrs. Smith just takes her mask off. No one's on the elevator, so no one's going to give her this weird look, and no one's going to hold her accountable for not wearing her mask in this analogy. But what she doesn't know is that Mr. Jones just got off and deposited coronavirus in the air. Her mask is off. She inhales, whether she breathes through her nose or her mouth. We do both of those, mostly through our nose. And now we're talking about how the majority of people get infected by the coronavirus. Her mask is off. She is inhaling, and she is inhaling a coronavirus that will do what? Grab onto her cells, punch holes, and deposit the entire coronavirus RNA. And then she gets to the 5th floor. She puts her mask back on. She exits the elevator. And now, although it has already been going on in Mr. Jones's body, Mrs. Smith is now, she had no idea that the coronaviruses are grabbing onto her cells, punching holes, and depositing the RNA. So she now has been infected.